Let's move on to the NFL. It's Wildcard weekend. It's an amazing weekend, really, if you've only decided to start watching games in the NFL like Owen has in the last couple of weeks. Then not a bad time to get back into it. But I'm delighted to say Mike Carlson is with us this morning. Mike, how you doing?
I'm fine. I've gotten back into it. I watched that match at Thomond Park on Saturday. It was a good one. But I woke up this morning to find out that Mean Gene Okerlund died last night. So a moment of silence for Mean Gene, the WWF interviewer, ringside interviewer, and announcer, and all. He was a master of what he did.
And so, what was so special about what Mean Gene was able to do?
Oh, you know, when you're interviewing professional wrestlers, you have to be able to do that kind of faux double take and all the extraordinary things they say, and at the same time, big up the ones that are supposed to be bigged up. And he was just very good at it. I watched in tribute. I watched this wonderful YouTube clip of Don Morocco and Mr. Fuji doing stand-up comedy on the late night talk show that Gene Okerlund hosted for WWF for a very, very short time, and it's hugely funny.
One of the other stories that we wanted to talk to you about before the wildcard weekend was what's going on with the Pittsburgh Steelers. Jesse James described it as it's like the Kardashians. There's always something going on. He's the tight end who might be on his way out. And it is a soap opera.
It is a soap opera. Kardashians is pretty good. It's like half football and half circus. What it is Antonio Brown got into a fight with Ben Roethlisberger, the quarterback, during the week before the final game against Cincinnati, and wound up throwing a ball either at him or at his feet because he said that Roethlisberger couldn't get the ball to him and kept throwing balls at his feet, and they got into it, and then he stormed off and didn't go to practice the next couple of days, didn't go to team meetings on Saturday, and showed up for the game as if he were going to play. Mike Tomlin didn't let him play. Pittsburgh won the game anyway, so in the end that was inconsequential, although it was a very close game with a bad Cincinnati team. They didn't get in the playoffs, and what you're getting now is a combination of the Steelers in discipline, and Mike Tomlin, known as a sort of quote-unquote players coach, who lets the guys go. They're a tough team that's kind of freewheeling. Antonio Brown's ego, which after this incident, many people, including his ex-teammate Ryan Clark, who's now a commentator, were talking about various incidents over the years where he puts himself ahead of the team. And then, of course, this weird situation where coming into the season, Pittsburgh were a Super Bowl favorite in a lot of people's minds, including my own, because they had the killer bees, Ben Roethlisberger, Antonio Brown, and Le'Veon Bell, the running back. And, of course, Bell never played for them. They couldn't get a contract done with him. He never stepped on the field. Brown complained, and it seems that the thing that set it all off was that the players voted the team most valuable player and gave it to Juju Smith-Schuster, who's the other receiver, not to Antonio Brown. And I think that's why he was feeling particularly sensitive. And now Pittsburgh's left with a huge problem because he makes so much money that any team in the league would love to have him. And his price is not unreasonable in contract terms. But if Pittsburgh trade him or release him, their salary cap will take a hit of something like $26 million, which is more than almost 15% of the cap. So they can't really afford to get rid of him, and they have to therefore come to some kind of accommodation to get him to play. He's a wonderful receiver, easily one of the 5 best in the league.
There's been a glorious sequence of tweets that have been coming out, which we can pull up now. So this was his Instagram post, I think it was. My options may seem limited by people or circumstances. It's then that I remind myself I am in command of my attitude. I am divinely blessed with free will. I utilize that gift, choosing to take charge of my life, to express the creativity, vitality, and wholeness that truly define me. So that was his Happy New Year message. And then he starts following the 49ers on Instagram, and George Kittle gets involved. George Kittle's the best tight end in football at the moment.
Football looking for wholeness.
Yeah, it's a bit weird. Kittle goes, sup, AB84, and then Antonio Brown gets back with the emoji with the 2 starry love hearts in his eyes. And then after that, Richard Sherman gets involved too, and you're like, ooh, this could be, stick him in the Kyle Shanahan offense and let's see how it goes.
Yeah, and like a good soap opera, this one's going to run and run. I think I would tune in every week to see. And it's sad in a sense that Pittsburgh didn't make the playoffs, because what they would do this week with Antonio Brown, were they in the playoffs, would have been the most fun thing to watch of all.
Yeah, I mean, I half wondered if they made the playoffs, do they somehow get a deal done with Le'Veon Bell? I mean, I know that technically they might not
can't.
They weren't allowed to.
Mean, they're not allowed to. Yeah, the time passed for that.
Yeah, okay.
Is there any sort of real sort of common denominator between the Bell situation and the Antonio Brown situation? Because the way you're explaining it there, it does seem that there is very different situations going on here. But could we say that Big Ben perhaps is a problem? I mean, he probably beat the life out of anybody in that locker room at the moment, but he's probably bigger than all of them. But I do wonder if he is the issue. That's a
good point, Owen. And I don't think he is specifically or in the main part, but I think he's part of the problem in that not everybody, but Antonio Brown, I think, wants to be the star and thinks that the focus is on Ben and that Ben doesn't give him the service he requires. With Le'Veon Bell, he wanted to be paid sort of like a quarterback, but more specifically, he wanted to be paid both as a running back and a wide receiver, because he felt that the way that the Steelers used him, often lining him up at wide receiver, justified that. So he wanted to, so both of the players want to be rewarded, and I think in Bell's case, in Brown's case at least, I think he feels he's being held back somewhat by Ben, but in reality, Ben has been wildly inconsistent, but he's got the best pair, or one of the two best pairs in the league of receivers, in Schuster and Brown. So you can't be targeting one guy all the time.
Yeah, is Roethlisberger overrated at this point in his career?
Oh, that's a really hard one. I think in the sense that he looked kind of rickety toward the end of the season at his age and the number of hits that he's taken, probably. But he plays that kind of playground ball that the Steelers are so good at. When the game comes toward the end and things break down, that's when he's at his best. And when you go back and look at the Steelers season, they lost games because Chris Boswell fell down on a kick, missed a kick early in the year. They lost games because Mike Tomlin made a couple of bad decisions. They lost games because Ben threw some bad passes. But basically, they should have been in the playoffs. No one really would have wanted to play them. And when you come down to a close game at the end, Ben's one of those guys that you most want to have on the field.
Okay, let's move forward to Wildcard weekend. In terms of the games this weekend, there's a bit of doubt, really. I suspect the most doubt that people have is what's going to happen in the game between Dallas and Seattle. There was a sense that, certainly the line has telescoped a bit, and people are very unsure about how good Seattle really are, and also, I think, how good Dallas is.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. Nobody can really get a handle on this. The other big factor is that the Seahawks are, generally speaking, a different team away from home than they are at home. They're much more aggressive at home, and it's much harder for an offense to play in their stadium with all the noise against that defense. So if you ratchet their defense down a step because they're on the road, it then makes them a little bit vulnerable. And Dallas is a good enough defensive team this year to be able to, if they play the game right, contain Russell Wilson, which is probably the key point in stopping Seattle. They're going to get their yards running, but if you can stop Russell Wilson from beating you with his creative play, scrambling and either gaining yardage on the ground or throwing the ball, they can beat you. And Dallas, nobody really wants to be convinced by Dallas, I think. You always look at the flaws, but they can run the ball too. And there's a lot of teams in this playoffs who are run-first teams, and depending on their defenses to carry them through. And Dallas's defense has been surprisingly good this season.
Yeah, that's interesting, because obviously when you think about Dallas running the ball, you think about Ezekiel Elliott, who's been in sublime form in patches this season. Like, when it comes to Seattle's run defense, is it good enough to stop him? Because it seems that if you stop Zeke, you've got a very, very good chance of beating the Cowboys.
Yeah, it probably is, and that's the thing. They're strong up front. Bobby Wagner's had a fantastic season at middle linebacker. They don't really have a sort of Cam Chancellor figure yet which they need, a sort of safety who can be the fourth linebacker. But McDougald's done a pretty good job for them, and their defense looks an awful lot like it used to. I think Seattle's sort of a year ahead of where we thought they would be, all told. And the real challenge for Dallas will be stopping, I think, the receivers. If they try to stop that Seattle run game. Tyler Lockett's been phenomenal for Seattle the past 4 or 5 weeks. He's always a deep threat, but he's caught the balls, every ball that he's thrown. And Doug Baldwin is Wilson's favorite receiver. And when Wilson starts scrambling, Baldwin's one of the best ever at getting himself open, and Wilson and he understand each other, where they're going to go when the play breaks down. So that's really the question for Dallas, is stopping those two guys, even once you've contained Ezekiel Elliott.
Mike, the NFL season from this point forward is generally, with the exception, I would suspect, of the New England Patriots over the last decade or so, unbelievably unpredictable. And if you think back to this time last year, the point you're making about Dallas, nobody really wants to be convinced by them. Nobody really wanted to be convinced by the Eagles this time last year. Everybody thought that Foles had limped into the end of the season, and then all of a sudden, even within the playoffs, within that game against Atlanta, they should have lost. He throws what should be an interception that bounces into the hands of one of his receivers, and it's like, okay, they get away with that. Like, you think back to these moments changing the entire season. It's just it's a proper wild weekend this weekend.
I think so. I'm looking down the matchups, for picking them, and I still haven't really picked the games. And I'm thinking, now that's a really good matchup. That's a really good matchup. That's a fantastic matchup. And Philadelphia-Chicago is great because Chicago lost 4 games this season, and in each of the 4 games, the opposition scored 24 points or more. And if they didn't, Chicago won every other game. And when you look at the Eagles, you have to figure they can score 24 points, even against the Bears' defense. So that makes that one fascinating. Foles has played just like he did at the end of last season, and the people are starting to realize the differences between him and Carson Wentz. The main one being he gets rid of the ball a little bit quicker, gets sacked fewer times, and goes deep downfield more often. And that's the way the Eagles offense works best. And to me, nobody's mentioned that I've seen, but to me, the big difference in the Eagles in the last couple of weeks, Tim Jernigan is back, who's a defensive tackle, who they picked up last season from Baltimore and played really well. And they have an older defensive line and not much depth. But when Jernigan is in there, he occupies 2 blockers. It takes a lot of pressure off the other guys. And all of a sudden, Michael Bennett last week and Chris Long didn't look like 35-year-old pass rushers. They looked, re-energized. And that's what made them in the playoffs last year. So, I wouldn't write off this Eagles team, although I think in Chicago, the Bears have to be, legitimately favorites, and the line's not going to sway too much the way it did with Seattle and Dallas.
Yeah, so there's 6 points favorites, I think, certainly they were yesterday. Just on the Nick Foles, Carson Wentz issue, at what point do Philadelphia legitimately think about trading Carson Wentz? Because you get a bounty of picks for Carson Wentz. You can get a multiple number ones from a bunch of teams around the league. At what point do you think, okay, this is worth it?
It would be a huge risk to trade him, and a huge story. And the problem, of course, is that in the NFL, like in America in general, money talks. And Wentz is on his rookie contract, so he's a bargain at quarterback. Whereas Foles will be negotiating a new contract, which would be a whole lot more. And Foles can buy himself out of his contract. It's a two-way option. The team could release him, or Foles can buy his way out for a couple of $1 million. And on the free agent market now, Foles is going to be going for over $20 million a year. So it's highly unlikely that the Eagles can afford to keep him when they have Wentz, who, even if you were to say, okay, I think Nick Foles is a better quarterback than Wentz, which I don't think anybody is actually saying, but even if you did, is Wentz at $5 million that much worse than Foles at 22 or whatever he would get paid? And that's going to be the kind of logic the Eagles follow.
Mike, I think it's pretty easy to make an argument against the line on this game. Like, you talk about defenses winning games or winning championships even as the oldest cliche in American sports, but and of course home field advantage comes down to favour Chicago Bears as well. But how important is the Trubisky factor in all of this? Because you look at him and you look across at the other offense and you look at not only a quarterback who's good in the playoffs, a quarterback who astounded the world last year and going all the way to winning the Super Bowl. How big a factor is it that Mitchell Trubisky just hasn't proved himself at this level yet?
It's a good point, and the Bears' offense has never been convincing this year. They're where they are because of that defense, but the defense has played so well and created so many turnovers that they've been able to win. In the last 4 games of the season, they allowed a total of 42 points. Which, if you do that, you're going to win every game you play. And Trubisky. The real worry about Trubisky will be that he'll make 1 or 2 big mistakes, and then if he does, you don't want to have to play from a hole. If you're the Bears, you want to play with a lead or with a close game, because you can let your defense do the business for you. And yeah, I think the Eagles in 6 is probably going to tempt an awful lot of people. And if it went a point higher, I think you'd see a landslide of money falling into Vegas.
The other massive matchup this weekend is what we're going to see from the pass rush of Houston and what they're actually capable of doing, because JJ Watt was somebody who we wonder if his career was over. He's an absolute superstar. A little bit slow to come back in the early part of the season, just in terms of, the sack numbers were there, but the performances, everybody thought, oh, he's not quite the same player. And then as the season has gone on, it's like, well, JJ Watt's just as good a player now as he ever was.
Yeah, and it's not a glamorous matchup, but it's a really great one, because Indianapolis and Houston played twice during the season, and Houston won in Indy by 3. Indy won in Houston by 3. They match up well because Indianapolis protects Andrew Luck better than any team in the league, basically, partly because Luck is smart and knows how to get rid of the ball. So that helps to work against Houston's pass rush. And Houston are not a great offensive team. Deshaun Watson takes too many sacks himself because he kind of tries to make himself stand in the pocket and let plays develop. He only has DeAndre Hopkins as a downfield receiving target. Demaryius Thomas is injured. Lamar Miller came back this last week, and that makes a huge difference for them, because they're another team that would really like to run the ball and play defense as their way of winning. And interestingly, the Colts defense is actually, like Dallas, is actually pretty good and very similar, because their defensive coordinator was the linebackers coach in Dallas last year, Matt Eberflus, and the rookie Darius Leonard has just been outstanding at linebacker. Dallas has the rookie Kyle Van Der Esch, who's also been outstanding at linebacker. So you've got 2 very similar situations. They play by swarming to the ball, basically, and if Deshaun Watson, Russell Wilson, Deshaun Watson. Again, there's a lot of similarities in these playoffs. If he can make a few plays with his feet.
It'll be interesting to see what happens.
Yeah, I'm just like, it's probably one of my favourite weeks of the sporting year. It helps that there isn't a whole pile of clashing with the NFL Wildcard weekend. It tends to always fall on FA Cup third round weekends, which gives you a bit more time. But it's just
Saturday evening also helps.
The fact that it's Saturday, like we got it a couple of weeks ago. Once the college football season's over, that's when my attention turns to the NFL, because we finally get a bit of Saturday night action. It's like getting up at 5 a.m. on a Monday morning isn't exactly conducive to watching NFL. But this is the weekend where you're like, these amazing storylines all coming to the fore, getting to watch the games in full, particularly on a Saturday night, as you say, and just sinking your teeth into some of these matchups. It's fascinating. Like he was talking about Deshaun Watson there, watching a bit of him on Red Zone the day before New Year's Eve, kind of being sent out into the trenches. And we were just talking a bit off air about it. You were saying that it's not necessarily as bad as, say, Dak Prescott being sent out there. I think we've re-established, Mike. I just don't understand, Mike. Maybe explain to me why somebody like Deshaun Watson, who obviously suffered a terrible injury last season, is being thrown out there time and time again by the Houston coaches. I think he's been sacked 62 times this year.
Yeah, and like I said, most of that, or a good part of that, is down to his waiting in the pocket, waiting for things to develop. And I don't think he's got the receivers to get open, easily enough. And that makes it hard for him. But you don't have much choice in these games, I think, because you depend on his ability to create. He's been sacked, 52 times, but when he isn't sacked, he makes things happen running the ball. He's not running first the way he did when he first came into the league. He's trying to protect himself that way. And you remember, I think what I was saying when my Skype all of a sudden overheated from the frequency of my talking. Back in Week 11, we talked after that Rams-Chiefs game, the 54-51 game, about, is the NFL becoming an all-offensive league, wild shootouts and things like that. Well, if you look at the playoffs now and last week, you've got a whole bunch of teams that are defensive teams, run-first teams like Baltimore. Baltimore's playing the Chargers, which is a run-first team with a great defense against a pretty wide-open offensive team in the Chargers. You've got the Bears there. You've got Seattle there, all of whom are, basically kind of low-scoring teams. And the Bears, when they played the Rams, remember, they won that game, 15-6. They held the Rams to 6 points, so that defense is for real. And I just think this is a fascinating weekend, and it points out the way that the NFL is unpredictable. Just when you think you've got it figured out, everything spins around, and the fact that a quarter of the coaches in the league get fired every year is a good sign of that. I also like your Boston Red Sox baseball in the middle of the desk. That's a fine sign.
There you go. There was one point though that traditionally over the last 5 or 6 years, there's been one crap team who makes it this far, and they get blown out in the early game. This year, it looks like
the Titans upset the Chiefs last year. They were the crap team, weren't they? Am I right in saying that, Mike?
I just remember the Texans and the Bengals getting blown out in game after game on Saturday. You're like, a game I can sit down on Saturday evening and watch, and then 15 minutes in, you're like, can I really justify watching this blowout for the next 3 hours?
Not this
There's
year.
no 8-8 team in the playoffs this year for the first time in a while, and like we said at the beginning, the Steelers could easily have been in there. So there still wouldn't have been a crap team. I think you're right, and these matchups this week show that. Probably on paper, the worst team is either Houston or Dallas or Philadelphia. It's like, take your pick. There's not really a bad team among them.
Yeah, the Ravens Chargers has the potential to be like a proper amazing game where you have this live wired genius young quarterback who is capable of running for 150 yards, but he also is actually a better passer than people give him credit for, against Phillip Rivers, who finally has the team to justify the incredible talents that he has had for his entire career. He's like reaching that point of his career where he could go on and win a Super Bowl and be considered John Elway-esque, like one of the all-time greats, or he might not fulfill his potential.
Yeah, and this seemed to be the year when things were going to go right for the Chargers, who are the kind of team where something always seems to go wrong and get in the way. But this is a hard game for them, not least because when you come from the West Coast and you have to play the 1 o'clock game, it's tough on your body. Teams that do that often are slow starting because their body clocks are still set on early morning California time. And we saw that with Seattle a couple of times, playing Carolina and playing Atlanta in the playoffs with very slow starts. So Baltimore is a very good defensive team at all three levels, and that's going to be the problem for the Chargers. Lamar Jackson obviously is the problem defensively for the Chargers, and they're a good defense, but they're a better defense pass rushing than they are. I think that's going to be the key for them again. And sooner or later, someone's going to stop the run by stopping Lamar Jackson and putting him out of the game, which is why in the NFL historically you don't see many quarterbacks in run-first offenses. So I kind of like the Ravens at home in this one.
Okay, so if you had one pick that you were, advising us all to put our money on. I was going to try and find a subtle way of saying that, but there's no subtle way of saying it. What's your lock of the week?
I'm going to say Baltimore, but simply because I have the most confidence in that. But I haven't looked at what the spread is, so take it with a little grain of salt. And I worry about Chicago, but I think in the end, I'll probably wind up picking Seattle, Baltimore, and Chicago. I kind of like the Seahawks going in, and I still haven't figured out Indianapolis and Houston. I'm kind of edging toward the Colts, but I haven't convinced myself yet.
Yeah, fair enough. Mike, good stuff. Enjoy the weekend. Thanks a million for joining us.
Yeah, thank you guys. Have a happy New Year.
You too. We'll talk to Mike Carlson again real soon after this weekend. But Definitely, if you haven't been paying attention, this is the bit where the coverage gets good. There's no red zone, so it's not quite as exciting. It's a bit more calm.
No, but
It's time to go out and get drinks.
Well, the last red zone was crap as well because all the good games were later on. So I've kind of weaned myself off red zone to a certain extent. I'm looking forward to putting Mike in his place when the Eagles take down Chicago at the weekend. Despite the fact that I spent about 20 minutes actually looking at this game, and Mike's been studying both teams in close detail all year. But sometimes there's a bit of beginner's luck when it comes to tipping matches.
So you're picking Chicago.
No, Eagles beat Chicago.
Did he not? What?
No, he said he's a little bit worried about Chicago, but he's still backing them.
Yeah, he was taking the points though, so it's a close game.
Yeah, no, it will be. But I think Mike's going to be wrong on that one.